This is Interpreting Wine host and founder Lawrence Francis, welcoming you to this, my Willamette Valley Winemaker Special. Across these 20 episodes recorded in quickfire fashion in January 2020, I got to meet a broad selection of people making wine in the region, both a variety of winemaking scale from the micro to the macro, and also different focuses that include different aging vessels, different grape varieties, sparkling wines, and of course different interpretations of Pinot. Episodes are going to be released in the order that they were recorded, so you'll get to be a virtual guest on the tour. 2 things you can do to help spread this series even further. One is to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, either where you're listening or on your favorite podcast platform. And the second, the one that's really going to help push this out there, is to head to interpretingwine.com/iTunes and leave a review letting me know what you think. A genuine, huge thank you in advance. Today's episode of the Willamette Valley Winemaker Special features Doug Tunnell of House Vineyards. A natural storyteller with now 2 illustrious careers under his belt, we hear Doug's origin story and transition back into the Willamette Valley and his winemaking life. He gives us a virtual property tour, speaking to the terroir again on multi-levels. Before we sit down and taste 3 of his wines, a Chardonnay, a Gamay Noir, and a Pinot Noir, all incidentally available in the UK. Interestingly, this episode talks a lot about production methods and places wine styles, and indeed grapes, in a Burgundian context. Enjoy.
So I'm Doug Tunnell, and I am the founder and the winemaker and dishwasher and janitor here at House Vineyard, where we started growing grapes back in 1990. So this year, in fact, just in a few months, we'll be celebrating our 30th year of growing 3 different varieties, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Gamay Noir, which from the outset we chose because I really thought that those were the great varieties of Burgundy, and that if we assumed back in 1990, as I did, that Pinot Noir did well in the North Willamette Valley and made good wine, then it seemed to me logical that those grape varieties that grow near Pinot Noir in France, i.e. Burgundy, would be the ones that we should grow here, that would relish a similar climate, similar soils, similar elevations, and such. So that's why we chose Chardonnay and Gamay Noir. The Gamay Noir was the real kind of maverick black sheep of the choices. Not many people, in fact, there were, I think, only 2 other vineyards that I know of were growing Gamay Noir here at the time. And we just decided to do it largely because a guy that was helping me lay out the vineyard, a very professional nurseryman and vineyard manager, had a bunch of cuttings of Gamay in his nursery and wanted to get rid of them. I said, sure, let's try it. I'd spent some time in Beaujolais and had always loved the area and loved the grape and loved the wines. And so it did seem that it might be a good logical choice. And we've never regretted that. We've never regretted any of the 3 varieties that we chose. So one thing I should mention, I'm maybe a little bit different than a number of the folks that you'll meet here, in that I grew up in this valley, and I'm a homie. I grew up just 30 miles from where we are sitting right now, and when I was growing up, all I could do was think about getting out of the valley. It was just some place to escape, and I didn't really have an appreciation for what was going on here, or for the agriculture and all of the riches that the valley I now appreciate has. So I did escape, and I lived overseas for a number of years, almost 25 years. But of course, after that time, found myself wanting to get back. And that's when I heard about these French families, especially the Durand family, buying land here in the valley in the North Willamette and planting Pinot Noir. And when I heard that, a little bell went off, and right away, I was living in Paris at the time. I called home and said, these people are making that commitment. We need to find an old farm, and just let's pursue this, because they know a lot. I don't know much. They know a lot, and if they're making the commitment, there's a good reason to believe it's a good one. So we did, and lo and behold, this is the farm we found, thanks to an old guy who was a friend of my mother's, family connection. My mother grew up out here in Yamhill County. I used to come and visit Grandma here, and so I had always had a sense of the county, a very youthful, almost infancy sense of what was going on. So then from the outset, we started the vineyard, and I can still remember at one point seeing a photograph of Henri Jaillet, a notable winemaker in Burgundy, if not a legendary winemaker. And he was sitting up on his tractor, this Bobard, and he had a big smile on his face. And I still remember that photograph, and I thought, okay, what we need to do is maybe think about modeling our farm, our vineyard, after that kind of life, after really the true vigneron, if you will. And so today we are estate grown. And yep, I have a tractor, and I am happy when I'm on it. In fact, I have more than one. Toys, boys and their toys. And so that was really the model that we pursued. Self-contained, estate grown, and we pursue that still today. We don't buy fruit from off the farm. And so our whole focus is to try to make wines that express this place. And I know you've heard it a million times, and people say it's all about terroir, but it really is. Here, for us, it really is all about expressing this particular site in so many ways that is not, you can't duplicate. It can only be done here. Everything from not only the vineyard and the soils and the aspect and the elevation, but even our native yeast culture is entirely unique. It's something that we're researching a lot about nowadays. We've never used a cultured strain to do a fermentation in this facility. It's been native from the very first fermentation year. So we love that kind of pursuit of purity, if you will, and have every reason to believe that strain is, or those strains, there are several actually, related strains, are unique to our location.
First, thank you. I mean, I think it's always very revealing, and it's always very interesting to me to hear how people kind of ask that initial question. Just kind of how did you get to be sitting here? And I love the way that you weave so many of those elements together. One thing that it does sort of just pique my interest, and it's a word I've written down here, is transition. Because using the word escape, from the valley, escape, it sounds like the title of a movie, doesn't it, almost? Getting out there and traveling the world, having a successful career. It sounds as though then, the way that you told it there, quite a big leap, really, quite a big change, having sort of gotten out there and sort of almost that one picture and that one feeling that you've described there kind of bringing you back. And I wonder, just in whatever way that kind of makes sense, if you wouldn't mind just kind of unpicking a bit that, because it sounds like quite a big sort of move round the other way that has brought you back and of course turned out wonderfully well. But I just wonder if you wouldn't mind just revisiting that transition point a bit more.
Sure. Well, when I was working in journalism, my previous career, I spent an awful lot of time in some very difficult places, and a lot of very difficult and dangerous and really heart-wrenching locations and situations, covering several wars and insurrections and a revolution in Iran and, lots of things like that for 22 or so years. And after a time, I realized I'm either going to dedicate my life to that or I'm going to come back home. And I just chose to come back home and to pursue a more serene and peaceful life. And I, again, never regretted that. And it did take some work to make that transition. It wasn't always easy. And it did seem big at certain times. Now I look back on it, and there is a certain logic to it. I see it. I see it pretty clearly. Even just from the practical point of starting to farm. My grandfather was a farmer, so it wasn't totally unknown to me. But you have to. Farmers are the most resourceful people on earth. You have to be resourceful. You can't always jump in the car and drive 8 to 10 miles to the hardware store. You've got to be prepared, and you have to understand what you need in order to repair your equipment or to get your job done, and think ahead and all of that. And all of those skills were things that I had to practice in my previous career as well. So in that way, I do think, there is a certain continuum there. And honestly, I'm just so happy that I made that choice. I'm not that tough. I can't take a whole lot of mayhem and bloodshed in my life anymore. I've had my fill. My cup is full on that. So here I am.
So having just come from the tasting room where we were just sat, we've come all of 20 meters outside, and we're standing out now in the vineyards. And really, in all of these interviews, I've been asking the guests to bring the listener here and almost bring them virtually to your property. And to ask you to talk to your terroir or your geography, whatever word kind of makes sense for you. And in some way, again, in whatever way makes sense, put this amazing property that we're standing in into a wider context, be that in the Willamette Valley, in the sub-AVA where we find ourselves, whatever kind of makes sense for you.
Well, one thing that we love to do here is to bring people out, even just a few rows into the vineyard, just a few feet, because so many people come and their lives are urban. They're really in many ways divorced from nature, and we are here in the middle of a 40-acre farm with 30 acres of grapes, and we are surrounded by 42,000 grapevines every day, all day long. We can bring people out, and at any time of year, they can appreciate, like right now in the winter, there's no fruit on the vines, the leaves have dropped, but we can talk about the cycles of nature. We can talk about what's left, about how we're going to prune these vines, which is going to be the next job coming up here in just a few weeks. But we love to do that. It's something we can offer. And it's something that is rather unique in that we are right in the middle of this farm here in the winery and where we do our tastings. We're at about 440 feet of elevation above sea level, and we're on the east slope of Ribbon Ridge, which is a little ridge that runs north-south. It's actually the smallest of the AVAs in the Willamette Valley. It's only about 3 miles long and about a mile wide. And we are overlooking the broader Willamette Valley from the ridge and out across the valley, which is quite broad at this point. It's about 30 miles across to the foothills of the Cascade Mountain Range. And on a clear day, we're looking straight at Mount Jefferson, which is one of 5 volcanoes that are visible from the ridges around here. And that speaks to our geology a lot. Obviously, this is a volcanic zone. We've got a lot of activity in that regard. In fact, those volcanoes largely shaped Western Oregon over eons. The time was when this vineyard was below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. It was the bottom of the sea at that time. The sea pulled back this land formation, rose up out of the bottom of the sea, and created what is now Ribbon Ridge, and in fact this western side of the Willamette Valley. We're only 43 miles from the Pacific Ocean here, so we are enjoying a maritime climate. That's very different than Burgundy, for example. We always like to say, well, we have similarities to Burgundy, but in fact, we are maritime. Another dissimilarity is our soils. For the most part, the Willamette Valley soils are on the acidic side. The pH is somewhere around 5.5, and that's very unlike Burgundy, where there's so much limestone that soil pHs are 6.5 or even more sometimes. And in that way, getting back to what that might portend, those soils are much more similar to Beaujolais, which is something that I didn't really appreciate for some years, but having done a little bit of research on that, we have a lot of similarities soil-wise with Beaujolais, and that might explain why we like the Gamay grape here so much. Another similarity with Beaujolais is silica. We have a lot of silica in these soils, and that is a common element that is found throughout Beaujolais as well. And maybe just my own theory, something that Gamay Noir, the vine, really takes to.
It does, I think, follow on very nicely from there. But yeah, just again, appreciating that we're stood in one of the vineyards. I mean, could you maybe say something to I guess those other 40 acres, so the 10, if my math's correct, that's not in grapes. What's going on there, and maybe as well the other 30 or so that are in grapes.
Sure.
What might we see were we to kind of do the same thing, go over there and have a look.
Right. Yeah. We have a number of different aspects in the vineyard itself. So looking down the row here, on the far side, several hundred yards away, there's a hillside covered with vines that is actually a north face. And yet the principal direction of that particular block is to the east, toward the mountain range and the Cascades. Out in front of us, just a few hundred yards, is a kind of a spine of a ridge that runs north-south, and the exposure there is almost entirely full south. That gets very warm. As you could expect, in this hemisphere, at this latitude, that north face stays cooler. So what that means for us in making wine and determining harvest dates, in the really warm years, which we've had a number of them recently, that north face is very important for providing bright fruit, a little bit better acidity, whereas in the cooler years, this south face is very important to us in terms of ripeness, richness, sugar. So we farm the vineyard, those 30 acres of vines, differently, and we harvest them differently, and we work with the wines differently. We have several different clones here, and in block by block, we are established different clones for different blocks, and that is where, when we get around to blending the wines, we'll go block by block, clone by clone, putting together the final wines. So if you were to be standing here, you'd see that there is a hillside which is up to our northwest, and most of that hillside is Gamay Noir. And out in front of the winery to the east is Pinot Noir, with Chardonnay just behind the winery. The Chardonnay, the fruit there travels all of, in some instances, 75 feet from the vineyard to the crush pad. So all of the fruit we bring in by tractor. It gets unloaded in front of the winery, and we then process it in a breezeway. The winery, by the way, it doesn't look like a lot of wineries. It's an old horse barn. It was built in 1931, and it's been a work in progress. We've been working on turning this old horse barn into a winery now for almost 30 years. It's still, every year we do something to it to try to make it work a little better, but it works well enough for us. Every wine we've ever made has been made right in this facility and bottled by hand in this facility, and so it's very much a product of this place. It's a 40-acre farm with 30 acres of fruit. And obviously, we live here, so part of the extra 10 acres that aren't counted into the vineyard is our home and the winery and all the roads that lead around it, the pump house and the tractor shed, and the oak grove, importantly, and the woods, which is down at the bottom of one of those blocks of Pinot Noir, just off to the southeast. And in the woods we keep wild. We don't do any sort of cultivation or mowing or in the woods, and that's part of our biodynamic commitment, is to have sort of wildlands, if you will, as a gesture to really untouched nature. Obviously, a vineyard, while it is natural, is highly manipulated. We even just growing grapes in a row is a very unusual thing for a grapevine, historically, or from its DNA origins. But we do it, and so we keep the woods wild, just as a reminder, a gesture of that really ultra natural environment. On the farm, we have a stand of Oregon white oak. It's called, is the general designation, and they're really large and pretty wonderful trees right in the middle, just beside the garden, in the heart of the farm. And they're very important to us for a number of reasons, not just only their beauty, but we have been doing the yeast research and discovered through that research the importance of oak bark. Because Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the winemaking yeast, can often and does overwinter and spend time in the bark of the oak tree. There's apparently enough nutrient, enough sugar in the dextrose or whatever form of sugar in the bark of the oak that it's one of those places that is an environment where that winemaking yeast can live, survive, and thrive. The other thing we discovered, which is fascinating to me, in the winter now we don't see them, but at harvest, as you know, we have many, many yellow jacket wasps that come around. And they, too, play a role for those native yeasts in that it's been determined that the gut of the yellow jacket wasp is an ideal birthing location for Saccharomyces. They are consumed by the wasp out in the vineyard, the little yeast, and they can then reproduce in the gut of the yellow jacket wasp, and that wasp will then move them around and expectorate them to feed its young and thereby multiply the presence of that yeast. And that was research that was done by a fellow that we've been in touch with in Italy at the University of Florence. Fascinating, though. They're now using yellow jackets as vectors to move native yeast cultures around in different Italian vineyards as sort of inoculums.
Moving along, we've now come back into the winery, back next to the fire, which is great. It's a little bit nippy outside, and this is where it would be great to hear you talk to three of the wines that you've selected from the range here, really in whatever way that makes sense for you. Build on that talk and that explanation you've just given of the terroir and the land there, and then draw the connection through to this bottle and to this wine and kind of how it then shows up in the glass.
Well, the first wine is our Chardonnay. It's a 2017, and we call it Cascadia, which is our reserve designation. Obviously, the reference to that range of mountains that we look out at just east of the farm, the Cascade Range. And it grows, it's actually a barrel selection, and it grows just outside the winery, very, very nearby, 4 different clones of the Chardonnay grape. I love Chardonnay. I am a great admirer of some of the wonderful white Burgundies that I've been able to experience from France, and that really is what informs my Chardonnay winemaking. In 2011, I had a great experience because our harvest was very late that year. The Burgundian harvest was very early, so there was a big window in between, and I took off for France and arranged to help a friend of mine make white Burgundy that year. And I say help him make, really, I just sort of cleaned up after him. But I got to see from the inside out what he and his friends in the village of Chassagne-Montrachet do when they're working with this wonderful fruit. I'll never forget the clarity, the beautiful condition of the Chardonnay grapes that they harvested from Chevalier Montrachet. He has 4 rows there, and it was almost otherworldly to see that kind of grape, and really an honor to be able to hang out and watch that get turned into juice and eventually ferment and become one of the world's great white wines. So that really informs a lot that I do with Chardonnay, and what that means is, my friends in Burgundy at the time and still all crushed the fruit going into the press, and I didn't do that prior to making that trip. And the first thing I did when I got home from France was buy a crusher for my destemmer. And we still to this day crush the fruit going into the press. And that gives us a more powerful press, if you will, a stronger press, where we're extracting a lot of very important compounds that we might not otherwise be able to press out. And those compounds, I believe, help to really prevent the wine from oxidizing overly in the bottle. What we do is make grape juice. We'll bring the fruit in, we crush it, we press it, make grape juice, and we let it be exposed to oxygen, so that all those oxidative compounds are oxidized right up front. They then drop out, and we move the wine off of that oxidative material, and the juice going into our barrels then has very little oxidative compound left. And as a result, I believe we have a wine that can stay fresh and that will age really well. And that's our goal with Chardonnay. The other thing is texture. Texture to me is so important in all wines, but especially Chardonnay. And so we give the wine, the Chardonnay, a total of 18 months, sometimes 20 months, in both neutral barrel, a little bit of new French oak, and then after 12 months in another 6 to 8 months in tank. So it's a good long time for that wine to absorb all the richness and the goodness. We do keep it on its lees, but again, those lees are lees that do not contain those oxidative compounds for the most part. And the only time we would rack it off the lees is if the lees were dirty, if we had problems with rot at harvest or diseased fruit in some way.
Generally you don't have masses to add to that, but I think one of the things to just share with the listener is I'm sure I've got a huge smile on my face because that is just, it's such a, in some ways it's quite understated. I think the way that it shows up in the glass, if you don't sort of give it its sort of due regard, I think you may sort of underestimate this wine. But there's sitting here a minute or so after having tasted this, that there's still complexity. It's a very clean wine. It's a very bright wine. It's kind of I think to me it's everything that I think is good about cool climate Chardonnay. I know this is a term that we've sort of hearing a lot more of now, and as the wine and the style sort of develops, and I think in a lot of ways, people's palates are changing and moving away from that. But this is just an absolute pleasure to drink, and I think it's one of those wines that you'd like to see it evolve. But if I had a case of this in my cellar, I'm not sure that it would survive long enough to watch the evolution. So it's probably a good one to, if you have this wine, put it in bond, lock it away, and get a bottle out every year, every couple of years, and really kind of follow its evolution. It's a gorgeous wine.
Well, we love Gamay Noir too, and it's kind of in terms of Burgundy, it's a little bit of a black sheep. The Duke of Burgundy tossed Gamay out of the Côte d'Or, back in the 13th century, I believe. And it's always been sort of kicked around and just didn't get much respect. But we really love the grape, and it's, I must say, straightforward. It's what you see is what you get, and the winemaking is very much that way too. We bring the fruit in from our vineyard, and we destem it completely, which is unlike a lot of producers, especially in Beaujolais, where they do a carbonic maceration. They'll keep all of the fruit on its stems and put it into a sealed tank for fermentation. We, on the other hand, handle it very much like Pinot Noir. So we destem it completely, put it into fermenting tanks, and then keep it so that the cap of the wine is punched down, the cap of the juice, I should say, is punched down 2 or 3 times a day, depending on the vintage. This is another thing that there's just no recipe. Almost everything I say about production is subject to change from one year to the next. But 2 or 3 times a day, we punch it down, we keep the cap wet, and we let it undergo a fully natural fermentation. And that's generally, 21 days or so from the time the fruit comes in. And then after that, we put it all in neutral barrels for aging. No new wood with the Gamay, because we want really the fruit, this beautiful, bright, vibrant fruit to come through in the final wine. It'll stay in those neutral barrels for roughly 11 to 12 months until the next vintage is almost ready to pick. We empty the barrels, and then we bottle it by hand here in the winery. Pretty straightforward. The beautiful thing about Gamay, in my book, is that unlike Pinot Noir, it's, as a red wine, got a stable pH. It comes in at a really beautiful point of about 3.2 or 3.25. It'll ferment. During fermentation, that pH goes up to maybe 3.4, or so, 3.45. We put it through full malolactic so that it finishes around 3.5, which is really a nice kind of golden number for a red wine in terms of its acid balance. It also takes a little longer to get ripe than Pinot Noir, and so for the most part, the alcohol is a little bit lower, and the result then is what I believe is a pretty vibrant, bright, and very food friendly wine. The other thing I love about the Gamay is it goes with almost any kind of fruit. It'll stand up to a tomato sauce or a pizza, and as I said, what you see is what you get. I mean, it's a great wine for a summer lunch, a Tuesday afternoon, on a somewhat warm day, and chill it down, and it'll just really it's delightful. Or Tuesday night watching, or Monday night watching a football game, with your pizza. Yeah. So it's very durable, and we love it.
Kind of, yeah. Before I try this as well, I mean, could you maybe just talk a bit to the point that this is the reserve Gamay Noir, and potentially what might be some of the differences in production and winemaking that separate it from the other one?
So the reserve Gamay Noir we call due east, and that's because it's grown on a hillside that is very steep, and the rows are oriented east-west, unlike almost all the other rows on the farm, which are north-south. We had to move the rows around east-west. Otherwise, this hillside would be too steep for a tractor to negotiate. It would be too dangerous. And so we gave the wine the name Due East. It is principally of one clone of Pinot Noir, clone 358, which really sets it apart from our other bottling. The less expensive entry-level Gamay is from two different clones that in the French literature they consider to be production or workmanlike clones. This, clone 358, according to the French literature, is suitable for fine wine. And indeed, we did find that to be true right here on our farm. It seems to be the case. And so we designate it as a reserve. And we handle the two wines in exactly the same way. But we find just a little bit more richness with the reserve. And this particular vintage, as many vintages of Gamay from our vineyard, displays quite a lot of pepper and also some crushed cherry characteristics, to my palate at least. And those are pretty common year in, year out to the Gamay that grows here on this location.
I'll just add to that, my reaction there, and it's just that is just absolutely gorgeous. It feels so Moorish, I know that there is the expression that the French often use as a compliment to wines, that glou, a bottle sits on the table and it disappears, and that's the biggest compliment I think that they're trying to give, that the wine, the best wine, is the one that's even not spoken about. It just sort of disappears, and that's not to say that that statement you made earlier around versatility, I think that kind of is underpinned here because there's fruit, there's richness, I think there's complexity, there's acidity, there's that kind of peppery almost kind of herbal nature, and it just, but overall, it all comes back into balance, and it's a wonderfully balanced wine, and just again one of those wines that for me just an absolute pleasure to drink. Yeah.
Well, the Pinot Noir that we're tasting, we call Evelyn's. This is 2017 vintage, and it's named in honor of my mother, who was a country girl who grew up only about 5 or 6 miles from our farm, on two farms actually that were in her family back in the 20s and 30s and in the old days, and we honor her because, well, she was such a character in addition to being my mother, and it really, she was the one who was sort of instrumental in finding our farm for us. And then ironically, when I decided to move here and pursue wine growing full time, she couldn't believe that I was going to live back in Yamhill County. It was a place she had tried to escape all those years. And I remember her looking at me and saying, "Well, who will be your friends?" She just couldn't believe that I could be happy in this rural agrarian location, out in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. But well, I am, Mom. She's no longer with us, but we make wine for her in honor of her almost every year, but not quite. What bottlings, what reserve wines we make will vary with vintages. They vary with how much fruit the vineyard gives us. As estate growers, we're really in the hands of Mother Nature in terms of our production. Some years we have a large crop. Some years we have a small crop. Some years we have to tear out vines to replant. Some years those vines come back and we have more fruit. So it's kind of ever-changing, which of course is a challenge especially for our distributors, who would really rather deal with a consistent production level. But thank goodness we have distributors that we've been working with for so long, so many years. They understand us, they know our quirks, and they will abide and stick with us, even though they're going to get half as much Gamay this year than they had the year before, or a quarter of the Evelyn's bottling that they are used to and could sell. But they're loyal, and we remain loyal to them. It's a very important part of our business. So Evelyn's Pinot Noir is actually the best of the best. It's a barrel selection. We choose the best barrels and put together the best blend we can. It's our most expensive wine, and really something that, again, we don't do every year, but only when the vintage allows it. So the Pinot Noirs are made in a way that is quite traditional. It's not anything that we change very much from year to year, unlike the Chardonnay. I'm always changing and trying to grow with the Chardonnay production, whereas I really feel with Pinot Noir we don't have it all, but we have a good regimen of practice that really produces a consistent product. We bring the fruit in. Depending on the year, we will keep a certain portion of the fruit on its stems with a whole cluster fermentation. In this particular year, the 2017, the whole cluster component was about 35% for Evelyn's. So with that whole cluster, you get the tannins from the stems in the fermentation. And that's something that you have to be very careful about, because you can overdo it and end up with a very, very tannic wine. But for the most part, I love the structure. If we get the percentage right, I love the structure and the aroma, the extra layers of flavor and texture that the stems bring to the wine. They also help the wine to be very ageable. And these wines, this wine, and the others that we do in this way, will age really quite well, thanks to, in large part, the tannin structure as a result of the whole cluster. We keep the Pinot Noir in barrel for at least 15 months, sometimes 16 or 17, depending on the vintage. And the barrels are about 35% new French wood. We don't want to overdo that wood, but a touch of the vanillin and the other characteristics that you get from new wood can really, we think, enhance the overall experience of the wine. So we do use new wood there, more there than on either of the other two vintages, either of the other two grapes.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much for all of your descriptions, and I think listening to you speak there and tasting the Evelyn's Pinot Noir here, the word that just keeps jumping to the front of my mind is a showstopper. It really, I love the way that you've chosen these, and that I think this is absolutely the right wine to finish the tasting on. And yeah, in the same way that for me as a very positive characteristic, the Gamay Noir, the bottle, would just sort of disappear. I think this speaks to me as a showstopper, because I just think it would stand out, on any table and in any sort of meal setting, and I think it demands attention because it's just got so many incredible layers going on, all in that harmony, and it's your care and attention in not making this every year, and what you've spoken to there in terms of the production. Kind of, to me, it speaks to somebody kind of orchestrating all of those elements, and again, in the same way that we hear so much in wine, and we hear in music, and in that sort of orchestration metaphor, in wonderful balance, the new wood coming through, and the fruit coming out there, and a real sort of piece of, I think, your story, the terroir, all coming together in a bottle and in a glass, and really, really striking Pinot Noir, and I think if you're lucky enough to have this, where you are, you can indeed sort of seek it out and come here. I highly recommend it. This is phenomenal. Really, just kind of last question from me, and I do just want to get my profound thanks on the record to you. I think it's been a really amazing experience coming here, and I think just almost in our arc, we started talking about your life outside of the Willamette Valley and your other career. We've come to the Willamette Valley and the terroir and the wines, and I think just really tell us something about where these wines are being enjoyed, out there in the marketplace. I know that these wines are, for example, in the UK. What are potentially some of the feedback, some of the stories, put these wines, I guess, in the context of, kind of the wider world and the world that will appreciate these wines.
Well, one of the reasons that I chose these 3 wines for us to taste is that all 3 of them are, in fact, available. We have shipped them to the UK, and I thought that would be appropriate. But we also ship them around the United States in other places. We have about 17 distributors now across the country. We're not in every market or every city. We just can't be. We're not that big. When we're producing, say, on average 4,000 cases of wine, we've been fairly selective, and so they're available in Boston and in New York and in Florida and in New Mexico, where we like to ship wine to places where we like to go visit, and so we love New Mexico. They're available in California and in Washington State and in Idaho and of course in Oregon and several other markets as well. We've shipped a little bit of wine to Toronto, Canada as well, and over the years we've also shipped to Japan, not with any regularity, but a little bit here and there. So, again, given our production level and the fact that we're just talking about a few thousand cases, they're a little bit difficult to find in some places. But we also ship directly throughout the United States to all but 1 or 2 states, I think, and that's a big and a very important part of our business. And we have a mailing list of about 2,000 names. Some of these people on our mailing list have been buying our wine since 1995, and they're still there. Bless their hearts, they're so important to us. But we add to that list. It's a case buyers list, so when people step up or visit the winery or call in an order, if they order a case or more, then we include them on that list, and there's a certain benefit. Then they get a special pricing, and they're invited to some events at the winery and like that. But for the most part, that's where we sell the wine, and a lot of it happens right here at this table where we're sitting now with Lawrence, and in the somewhat chilly January winter in the Brickhouse Vineyard.
Thank you so much, Doug. An absolute pleasure to be there, hearing you weave these elements of the story and the property together. If you are based within reach of Brickhouse Vineyards, I highly recommend a visit. Do see below for the Brickhouse Wines website, where you'll have details of all of the wines that we tasted, and indeed details of the direct-to-consumer offering. As Doug mentioned, the 3 wines that we tasted are available in the UK with A and B Vintners. So if you're based over here, those are the people to contact. If you're loving the Willamette Valley Winemaker Special so far, as I'm sure you are, do please spread the love to anybody who you think might like to hear these by sending them to interpretingwine.com/listen to subscribe and be alerted when new episodes go live. Next time in the podcast, in episode 385, Doug passes the baton across to Claire Carver, co-owner at Big Table Farm. And if you're not already, I would love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next time.